And I am the CEO of sea.citi. Sea.citi is a network of tech and innovation companies out promoting civic and community engagement. And we are so excited to have you here today. We have been doing this series, The Roadmap to Recovery, for the last number of weeks. This is actually our 6th event in that session. We have talked about all sorts of different topics, including the arts, immigration, transportation, housing and homelessness, and talking to community leaders along the way. These are fantastic, fun conversations to do, and we hope that the content is really impactful as it has been in the past. So before I kind of dive into today's session, so these events really came out of the work that we have done in the past. Typically, we would be doing these events in person. When COVID came, we, like everybody else, transitioned to online events, and not only to online events, but we also started making our events more public. And so typically these types of sessions would go on within tech companies and be limited to that group. So we're excited to see friends here that aren't just from tech, but also from other community-based organizations. So today we are going to be talking all about education, and we're super excited to have Lisa here with us. Before we get started, I also want to mention that if this is content that you like, please make sure to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already, or follow us on any social platform at sea_citi, CITI. Luanda, I think, will drop our handles into the chat. You can always tweet at us. That's always fun. And we love having additional folks that are in our sphere. So today, like I mentioned, we are talking about education, and we're going to hear from Lisa Chick, who is the CEO of the Alliance for Education. The Alliance for Education's mission is to support excellence in education by advancing educational justice and racial equality for students in Seattle public schools. They distribute funds to support excellence in public schools, provide training for teachers, and provide fiscal sponsorship services to school-related programs. Lisa is really an unwavering champion for kids with a record of delivering student-centered, equity-driven results that benefit the entire community. She's a Seattle native and is the daughter of a public school teacher and began her career as a humanities teacher. She went on to serve 20 years with City Year, which is a fantastic organization. And along that way, she was helping students in high poverty communities succeed in school. So welcome, Lisa. Super nice to have you. And first up, we would love for you to just give an overview of the Alliance for Education for us.
Happy to do that, Nick, and thank you so much for having me on this call. I'm happy to join. I should say that I was a public school teacher when I started. I'm also now the mom of 2 Seattle public school students, so definitely multi-generational fan of the public education system. And I'll tell you a little bit about the Alliance for Education. We are a nonprofit organization that was founded 25 years ago to really support Seattle public schools, and have for the last 25 years really thought about how we can bring resources into the Seattle public school system. And those resources could be great programs, they could be stakeholder partnerships, they could be dollars and other resources. But the idea was, what could the community do to make sure that our district here in Seattle was successful and had everything that it needed to serve students? Over the years, that work has been sort of evolving and changing. And as Nick mentioned, our mission statement today, you got it a little bit wrong. Nick, you were close. But our mission statement today is to support excellence in education by advancing educational justice and racial equity. You said equality, but it's equity for the students of Seattle Public Schools. And I am really proud to be leading that work for the Alliance and to have a great team working with me on that effort. And that work has taken lots of different forms in the last 4 years that I've been the CEO here. Most recently, we've been working really hard to make sure that the district can respond to the demands of what's happening with COVID-19. So that's been a huge effort over the last couple of months, and fits right into the other work that we've been doing over the years.
Great. I'm terribly sorry for botching your mission, because equity is, I think, what we're after, not necessarily just equality.
Right.
So, and if you don't understand the difference, maybe we'll host another conversation about the difference between equity and equality. So anyway, so first up, everyone knows that Seattle Public Schools has made huge changes in the last couple of months to continue to make sure kids are getting an education. How's it been going? What's been happening? What's working? What's not?
Sure. I mean, anyone who's got kids in the public school system, and probably most of you anyway, know that as of the middle of March, Seattle Public Schools operated as in an entirely remote format, which meant that no one was in the school buildings and all kids were hopefully learning at home. As you can all imagine, that presented some really incredible challenges to Seattle Public Schools staff and to our students. The district really focused right away on three things. And one was to make sure that our kids had access to the food that they typically have in the school setting, that there was child care available for students whose families had to go to work and couldn't be at home to care for them, and that there were remote learning supports in place to get kids learning even though they were at home and not learning in their traditional environments. I think most folks know that while we focus on what our schools can provide in terms of education, they are working all the time on the social and emotional needs of students as well. And schools are real resources to take care of the basic needs of students in addition to taking care of their educational needs. So how is it going? Well, the school year ended in June 19th. It was sort of an anticlimactic ending to the school year. None of the traditional, end of year parties and graduations and etc. I think there was a little bit of relief on everybody's part that we had gotten to the close, and it was challenging. I think everyone would agree here in Seattle and across the country, pivoting really fast to this remote learning environment was very challenging. I think Seattle Public Schools has a lot to be proud of. They were able to deliver food to thousands of kids and families in multiple locations across the city. That piece of the puzzle went incredibly well and was incredibly well utilized by families who depend on free or reduced cost lunches at their school sites. Childcare was set up across the city, and that was utilized for folks who couldn't take care of their kids in the home while their kids were doing remote learning. And I think remote learning was challenging. There were some real wins and there were some real challenges that were really largely focused on the need to think entirely differently about school. So schools are accustomed to having kids in space, being able to engage in small groups and large groups, to being able to present materials in a physical format, and having to make sure that all kids have access to print materials or online materials, have access to devices and the internet connectivity they need to receive information, and that teachers are prepared to deliver learning in a totally different format. That was a huge, huge lift. And I think, again, some real successes and some real challenges throughout that process. So how did it go? It was rough. And I think the district did a great job stepping up in incredibly trying circumstances. I think everyone's pretty glad that the school year is over and there's a chance to rethink things for next year. I will say that summer school is still on, and there's 345 SPS employees leading summer school classes right now, and 15,000 kids are enrolled in summer school, which is 6 times more than normally enroll in summer school. So school is not over for the year for a lot of kids and teachers right now.
Yeah, I just want to parse a couple of those things apart, or pull a couple of those things apart. But I think for some people, it might be really astonishing that that people in a city like Seattle do suffer from food insecurity. Can you talk a little bit about like how many kids go to school and need free lunch, and how much do they rely on it, and how many meals did Seattle Public Schools serve in the last couple of months?
Nick, you're testing my statistical data, having it on hand. I don't have the numbers for you on hand. I will say that approximately 30% of Seattle Public School students receive free and reduced lunch, and the district is made up of 54,000 kids. I believe towards the end of the school year, they were serving somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 meals a week, but I could be really wrong on that number, so don't quote me. I can get it to you as a follow-up. I do have that information. But there's a huge number of students in Seattle Public Schools who depend on the district for free or reduced cost lunch. And one of the really innovative things that the district offered was to not just provide lunches, but to provide breakfast as well, and to work with partners in the city like Fair Start to provide dinners in addition. Because as we know, COVID-19 has impacted everyone's mobility and access to things in the community, but has also impacted employment and dollars. And so a lot of families are struggling even more today than they were before to cover basic needs costs for their families.
Sorry to put you on the spot like that without giving you adequate prep. The other item that I wanted to touch in there is around that remote learning offering. And I think you started touching on really what a significant lift that is for teachers. I mean, are there more details that you can talk about within that? And maybe a subsequent question here would be, is this a point in time when remote learning starts becoming more as a mainstream offering within public education as a whole?
Mm-hmm. You know, this was one of the big challenges that Seattle Public Schools and all districts faced as soon as schools closed, was what do we do if some students have access to computers and internet and other students don't? And as a parent myself, I'll tell you, even for families who do have access to internet connectivity and to devices, it's still challenging to manage remote learning in your home. But if you have no internet connectivity and no devices, then there really is literally no access. So very quickly, the district worked to secure additional devices through contributions from folks like the amazing team at Amazon and others to give families better internet connectivity and to tee that up. And I think there is interest in like, what does this look like going forward? I should say that Seattle Public Schools is not a district that has done a lot to think about sort of internet platform-based learning over the years. And in fact, there's been a lot of really heated conversations over the years about curriculum that depend on internet platforms. So the science curriculum that recently adopted by Seattle was really controversial because there are a lot of folks in the community who felt like additional screen time for kids is not a good thing. In the context of COVID-19, I think folks are saying that essential learning in this context. And I do think there's potential for double transformations going forward. I think folks are seeing the opportunity and the potential, but it will really depend on, you know, what the school would believe and what does the superintendent believe, and how do teachers engage going forward. There's no question that it's going to create more skills, both for kids and for teachers, in terms of how to engage in this work. Everyone's had a stretch. And I would imagine that will influence things going forward. But the equity issue is really the bottom line. If we can't ensure that all kids have access to the tools that they need to access online learning, then it's not fair to go into a more remote dependent type of learning in a permanent way.
Yeah. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about the equity issue. We know that COVID-19 is hitting communities of color much harder than white communities. And sort of how is this pandemic playing out in inequitable educational outcomes for students of color and other marginalized groups?
I wouldn't want to speak for communities of color, but I will say that we know that outcomes for students of color in Seattle Public Schools are significantly different and less strong than for our white students in Seattle Public Schools, and that those inequities that have existed in the system for a long time were only amplified by COVID-19 and the challenges of COVID-19. And so I think what we're seeing, and the other thing I'll say is that in Seattle, many of our families who are experiencing poverty are also families of color, and that's not all, but many. And so the impacts of poverty were really significant relevant to COVID-19. So if, for example, you're a homeless family and you don't have access to your own space, then how are you going to do remote learning? If you are thinking about where you're going to go get food, how are you going to focus on learning? That's a problem throughout the school year, but even more complex when you're dealing with the challenges of a pandemic. So I think largely the access issues that students are facing, if you're dealing with poverty at the same time, they're amplified significantly.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there other issues that families that are facing poverty are grappling with? I mean, we've talked a little bit about connectivity and access to food. You just touched a little bit on housing stability. Are there other items that kind of come up in that piece of the conversation?
Well, the childcare issue is a huge, huge issue that families are facing right now in Seattle Public Schools. So if parents are not are essential workers, and sometimes those are families who are experiencing poverty, and sometimes they're not. But if there's a lack of resources and families are essential workers, parents are essential workers, then accessing childcare at either affordable or free rates is tough to do. And so figuring out, for example, next year, if we're back in school 2 or 3 days a week, whatever it's going to end up looking like, and you have to go to work, what do you do with your kindergartner? What do you do with your second grader? If your children are older, it's a little less complicated, but those kids still need supervision and support just in doing the online learning work. So it's certainly for families who have more limited resources, it's a much more significant problem. And the other thing that's important to note is that we're in an environment right now where families are experiencing significant trauma. And whether that's trauma related to the pandemic, because they've actually experienced illness, or just from the limitations that families are experiencing related to the pandemic, or whether it's trauma related to all the conversation right now about Black lives and the increased attention to race and racial equity in the system, that is certainly impacting the way students are feeling and experiencing the world. And one of the things that's definitely on the mind of our educator leaders in Seattle Public Schools is, how do we support students in a remote way when they're actually dealing with trauma related to what's been going on in the world for the last several months? So that's a whole other piece of the puzzle, much harder for counselors and others to reach out and connect with kids when they're not in school.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Can you started on that last piece right there, talking a little bit about what school might look like this fall. So what are the plans for fall this fall?
There's been some great documentation that Seattle Public Schools has put out. There are still a lot of variables that are being considered. There will be, I think, a final plan voted on and confirmed in August. I believe the goal is mid-August to get sort of a final plan in place. But the assumption right now is that there will be some combination of remote and in-person learning, with only 15 students allowable per classroom. The district surveyed families to ask what their intentions were for the fall. Somewhere around 70% said they wanted to be doing in-person learning in the fall. Somewhere around 20% weren't sure, and about 8% of families said they were not interested in going back into school buildings. Now, it wasn't a survey that all families participated in, and white families participated at higher rates than families of color, so there's more learning to do around that. But it was interesting that just in that survey alone, there was such a significant number of families who wanted to go back. It will be some kind of a blended model, we think. I think much depends on how the summer goes. If we move back into phase 1 in the state, then we'll be back to all remote learning. And the district is in the middle of beginning collective bargaining with the teachers union right now. And there's been a lot of national conversation around teachers being really uncertain about wanting to put themselves at risk by going back into the classroom. So too hard to say exactly what's going to happen, but it will not be everybody back in school and business as usual. That we know for sure.
Yeah, so real quick side note, if you have questions, make sure to send them over to Luanda. We've got about 5 more minutes left on this session. But one of the data points that you dropped in there was really interesting to me, that 70% of people said that they would like to have their kids do in-person learning.
Mm-hmm.
hypothesis on what's driving that? I mean, are people sick of having their kids in the house? Is that what's driving that?
Well, I know you're a dad, Nick, and I'm a mom. I do think that it's a few things. I think there is something to be said for parents just wanting their kids back in school so that they can get back to work. In some cases, it's that parents actually don't have a choice. They have to be back in work and they need that childcare. But I think there may also be just an acknowledgement that the experience of being in space with other students and with a teacher is something you can't recreate virtually. And it's a benefit to our kids. And our kids are missing that social interaction, that engagement with teachers as supporters and mentors and leaders. And everyone I know is really hopeful that we'll get past this, that the future is not going to be just kids staring at screens and learning from their teachers on screens, but the future will be actually working live and in person with others and in school settings at some point going forward.
Hopefully that point is sooner than later. I know
Wear
my
your
kids
masks, everyone.
yeah, exactly. Wear your mask, seriously. I know my kids would like to see somebody other than me or their grandparents at some point. So, there's a number of issues that we've kind of talked about that really intersect with public education and food security, digital equity. What are some ways that people can get involved and support what's going on right now?
Well, I think one, there's certainly volunteer opportunities, and folks probably know that sea.citi led a terrific volunteer opportunity to create a helpline for families who were struggling with technology related to remote learning. And I think there will be future volunteer opportunities like that at Seattle Public Schools. We know that when school reopens, and it is at least to some degree remote, that there will be lots of families still learning about how to navigate technology and needing that support. So that's something that is definitely being talked about. And I know there are other volunteer opportunities out there that are available through Seattle Public Schools. I think, you know, resources matter. The Alliance set up an education equity fund earlier this year to support additional expenditures that were required by Seattle Public Schools in order to support students who were dealing with remote learning. And so that fund is still out there, and, you know, contributions are definitely welcome. We also have something called the Right Now Needs Fund that addresses the basic needs of our students in Seattle Public Schools. That fund saw a 100% increase in requests for support over the course of the pandemic. And so what we know is that families' challenges around basic needs and addressing things like food, housing, medical care, clothing, those sorts of things, those requests are significantly increased, and we expect that only to continue. And then, you know, finally, I would just say there's a lot of criticism out there about what's happening in education, how the district did during the last 4 months, how districts across the country did. And I would encourage folks to just give the district some grace. I know that we all have very high standards for how our kids experience school and what education can provide, and we should. I would also say the challenges that the district is facing right now to navigate the current circumstances are unprecedented. That's a word everyone uses all the time. And I'm really thinking about, like, what can we do at the Alliance to support the district through this incredibly difficult time to make sure that our kids get what they need. So I think staying alert, learning, and thinking about how you can help is really the best way to approach the year ahead.
Yeah, one of the numbers that I heard was that it's going to cost the district about $15 million to retrofit all the buildings in preparation for having kids back in on, whether that's even in a modified model. I mean, the financial output or the financial cost associated with this are really significant. Is there, from a policy standpoint, or is there any policy that people should be aware of?
You know, I think there's a lot of interest both in Seattle Public Schools and around the country to looking at broadband for all, to looking at broadband as a public utility. And then I think continuing to pay attention to what's happening in our state legislature with regard to education funding. I've not heard sort of a policy push, but there are other folks in the community who are more actively involved in the legislative issues around this. So I'm certain there is work to be done. It's just that the Alliance typically gets involved in other ways, but not with regard to legislative issues.
Okay. One final question that just surfaced from the audience. It says, given all the changes we've learned exist given digital divides, is there any centralized or evolving census of what the situation is? How can community-based organizations get better and more precise info about what gaps are persisting and how we can help navigate?
Mm. Well, I know that the district has engaged in some surveys of families to try and really understand what families are dealing with, like where are the gaps, and they're getting more and more information about that over time, and understanding that surveys are not sufficient, so looking at focus groups with particular groups as well. So I think one of the small silver linings of this whole mess is that we're learning more about what families are really navigating at home, and that may be helpful. But I think the Alliance is working to try and communicate out to folks about what's going on in the district. The district has actually been really persistent about communicating out about what they're learning as well. And they have a lot of content on their website that updates folks about what they're learning and what they're seeing out in the community. So I think collaborating, reaching out to other nonprofits in the community who are working on similar issues, and all of us sort of rolling up our sleeves and figuring out how we can do this together is going to be a key strategy.
Yeah, great. Well, Lisa, it's really nice to see you as always, and really appreciate you coming by and chatting with us. So for those that are on the call, we will be sending a follow-up email, which will include links to some of the information that we talked about today and probably some additional information. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website in case you want to go back to it or share it with anybody else. We also typically put together a blog post that summarizes some of the learnings from this. We're really glad to have you here today. We are going to be taking a break from this series, the Roadmap to Recovery series, and we will be restarting a new series come the end of August, early September. Dates are still TBD, but would love to have you join in them. Again, they will be weekly short events like this. Nobody wants to sit on a Zoom call for 2 hours and listen to people talk about really anything, frankly. So, so thank you all so much for coming. And again, Lisa, the work you do is so critical to the community, and we're so appreciative to have a relationship with you. And thanks for coming by.
Thanks, Nick. Happy to be here.
Bye, everybody.